I thought 18 years of marriage meant something. I thought building a life together, supporting each other through every challenge, and creating a partnership that everyone admired would count for something when times got tough. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Instead, I discovered my husband packing his bags while his 26-year-old girlfriend waited in our driveway, engine running like she was the getaway driver in some ridiculous heist movie. What they didn't know was that I had been preparing for this moment longer than either of them had been alive. What they especially didn't know was what our prenuptial agreement actually said, and the financial tsunami that was about to hit them both. My name is Carolyn Weber, and at 45, I never imagined I'd be starting over. But here I am, ready to share the story of how my marriage ended and my real life began. It's a story about discovering strength you didn't know you had, about the power of preparation, and about what happens when people who think they're smarter than you realize they've made a catastrophic miscalculation. It started on a Tuesday morning in March. I was in my home office, finalizing a marketing campaign for one of my biggest clients, when I heard Richard's voice drifting up from the kitchen. He was on the phone, speaking in that hushed, intimate tone I recognized but hadn't heard directed at me in months. At first, I assumed it was a business call that required discretion, but something about his laugh made me pause. It was the same laugh he'd used when we were dating, when everything was new and exciting and full of possibility. I found myself creeping to the top of the stairs, feeling ridiculous for spying on my own husband in my own house. But the conversation I overheard changed everything. "I can't wait to get out of here," he was saying. "Just a few more weeks and we can stop pretending. She has no idea what's coming." There was a pause, then more laughter. "Trust me, sweetheart. By the time this is over, we'll have everything we need to start fresh." My heart hammered against my ribs as the implications sank in. Richard wasn't just having an affair. He was planning to leave me, and apparently believed he could take enough of our assets to fund his new life with whoever was on the other end of that phone. The betrayal cut deep, but what followed was something unexpected. Instead of the devastation I might have expected, I felt a cold, calculating clarity settle over me. I retreated to my office and closed the door, my mind already racing through possibilities. After 18 years of marriage, Richard thought he knew everything about me. He knew about my marketing consultancy, which had been moderately successful. He knew about our joint savings accounts and the house we'd bought together in Portland's desirable Forest Hills district. He knew about our shared investments and the country club membership we'd maintained for networking purposes. What he didn't know, what he'd apparently forgotten or never bothered to fully understand, was the prenuptial agreement we'd signed before our wedding. More importantly, he had no idea about the real scope of my financial situation. During our engagement, I'd been careful to downplay certain aspects of my background. Richard was older, more established, and had very traditional ideas about marriage and money. He'd insisted on the prenup, ostensibly to protect his real estate business, but I'd had my own lawyer review every clause. What resulted was a document that protected both of us, but with specific provisions that heavily favored the faithful spouse in case of infidelity. The afternoon dragged by as I maintained the pretense of normalcy. Richard came home at his usual time, kissed my cheek with the same casual affection he'd shown for months, and asked about my day as if he hadn't spent his lunch hour planning our divorce. I watched him carefully, noting details I'd overlooked before. The way he checked his phone constantly, the new cologne he'd started wearing, the fact that he'd been working late more frequently and going to the gym religiously after years of being sedentary. During dinner, I tested the waters with casual conversation. "How's the Sterling project going?" I asked, referring to his business partnership with Michael Sterling. Richard's real estate company had been struggling lately, though he'd been optimistic about several new developments. "Fine," he said, not meeting my eyes. Actually, Michael and I are considering some restructuring. Might be some changes coming. Up. I nodded, filing away this information. If Richard was planning to leave me, he'd need to secure his financial position first. The restructuring was probably his way of protecting assets or positioning himself for a cleaner break. Over the next few days, I began my own quiet investigation. I'd always been organized and detail-oriented, skills that had served me well in business and were about to become invaluable in personal crisis management. I started by reviewing our financial documents, bank statements, and investment portfolios. I made copies of everything, storing them in a safety deposit box Richard didn't know about. Then I began researching divorce lawyers. I needed someone experienced, someone who understood complex financial situations, and someone who wouldn't be intimidated by Richard's aggressive personality. Thomas Bradford's name kept coming up in my searches. His firm, Bradford Peterson and Associates, had handled several high-profile divorces and had a reputation for thorough preparation and strategic thinking. My first meeting with Thomas was eye-opening. He was a man in his early 60s with silver hair and the kind of calm demeanor that suggested he'd seen every possible variation of marital warfare. I brought our prenuptial agreement, our financial documents, and a detailed timeline of Richard's recent behavior changes. "This is quite comprehensive," Thomas said, reviewing the prenup. "Did you have legal representation when this was drafted?" "Yes," I replied. "Linda Parker, my sister, is also an attorney. She recommended someone who specialized in family law. I wanted to make sure I understood exactly what I was signing." Thomas nodded approvingly. "Smart move. Most people rush through prenups without fully grasping the implications." He looked up at me. "Caroline, based on what you've shown me, if your husband is indeed planning to leave you for another woman, he's about to make a very expensive mistake." That evening, I sat in my office reviewing everything Thomas had explained. The prenup contained an infidelity clause that Richard had probably forgotten about. If he could be proven to have cheated, not only would he forfeit his claim to any of my premarital assets, but he'd also be responsible for significant financial penalties. The document had been carefully crafted to protect the innocent party from the financial devastation that often accompanied divorce. But the prenup was just the beginning. What Richard truly didn't understand was the extent of my financial independence. Before we married, I'd been a co-founder of a small tech startup that developed marketing analytics software. We'd sold the company just months before my wedding, and I'd invested the proceeds carefully over the years, while Richard knew I had some investments. He'd never bothered to ask for details, assuming my contribution to our lifestyle was minimal compared to his real estate income. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The truth was that my portfolio had grown substantially over 18 years of careful management. I'd reinvested dividends, diversified across multiple sectors, and even acquired a few rental properties under my maiden name. Richard had been so focused on being the primary breadwinner that he'd never noticed I'd achieved financial independence years ago. As I planned my next moves, I realized I needed evidence of Richard's affair. Suspicions and overheard phone conversations wouldn't be enough in court. I needed concrete proof. The thought of hiring a private investigator crossed my mind, but I decided to start with my own surveillance first. The opportunity came sooner than expected. That Friday, Richard announced he'd be working late on a property showing. "Don't wait up," he said, kissing my forehead. "This client is flying in from Seattle, and we might grab dinner afterward to discuss financing options." Instead of my usual routine of reading or catching up on work, I decided to follow him. I felt like a character in a bad spy movie, sitting in my car across from his office building, waiting to see if he actually had a client meeting or if this was another cover story for his extracurricular activities. An hour passed before Richard emerged from the building, but instead of heading to a restaurant with a client, He drove to a trendy neighborhood I recognized as home to several upscale apartment complexes popular with young professionals. He parked outside a building called the Metropolitan and walked inside like he belonged there. I waited in my car, heart pounding, until I saw him appear in a third-floor window. A young woman joined him, and even from a distance, I could see their intimate body language. They embraced, kissed, and settled onto a couch together. The domesticity of the scene hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't just a casual affair. Richard was playing house with someone else. The drive home was surreal. I felt like I was watching my life from outside my body, observing this woman whose husband was cheating on her, whose marriage was ending, whose future was suddenly uncertain. But alongside the pain and humiliation, there was something else growing. A sense of purpose, of control returning to my life. Back home, I poured myself a glass of wine and sat in Richard's favorite chair, thinking about the young woman I'd seen in the window. She looked barely older than a college student, with long blonde hair and the kind of carefree energy that comes from not yet understanding how complicated life can become. Did she know Richard was married? Did she know about me? About our life? Together? About the promises he'd made and was now breaking? The next week brought more evidence. Richard's late nights became more frequent, his explanations more elaborate. He started talking about a potential business trip to San Francisco that would keep him away for several days. I began documenting everything, creating a detailed log of his absences, his stories, and any inconsistencies I noticed. I also started meeting regularly with Thomas Bradford, refining our strategy and preparing for what would likely be a difficult process. The key, Thomas explained, is to be ready before he makes his move. If we wait for him to file first, we lose the element of surprise and give him time to hide assets or create complications. During one of our meetings, Thomas asked about my support system. Divorce can be emotionally devastating, even when you're prepared. Do you have friends or family you can rely on? I thought about my sister Linda, who lived in Seattle but would drop everything to help me. There was also Nancy Rodriguez, my best friend since college, who'd been suspicious of Richard's recent behavior changes. Nancy owned a successful catering business and had always been the type of person who could see through facades and pretenses. I have people, I told Thomas. But I haven't told anyone what's happening yet. I'm not ready for that conversation. When you are ready, he said, you'll need their support. This kind of betrayal doesn't just end a marriage. It challenges your trust in your own judgment, your belief in other people's honesty. Having people who believe in you and remind you of your worth will be crucial. That evening, I called Nancy and asked if she wanted to meet for coffee the next day. We'd been friends for over 20 years, and she'd been the maid of honor at my wedding. If anyone deserved to know what was happening, it was Nancy. We met at Copper Moon Cafe, a quiet spot near downtown where we'd had countless conversations over the years. Nancy took one look at my face and immediately knew something was wrong. Okay, she said, settling into her chair with her usual directness. What's Richard done now? The question caught me off guard. What makes you think this is about Richard? Caroline, I've known you since we were 25. You get a specific look when you're dealing with his nonsense. You had the same expression when he forgot your anniversary last year and when he made that comment about your business being a hobby at the Sterling's party. I realized Nancy had been seeing things I'd been trying to ignore. It's worse than his usual insensitivity, I said quietly. He's having an affair. Nancy's face went through a series of expressions before settling on a familiar combination of anger and determination. Tell me everything. I shared what I'd discovered, from the overheard phone conversation to my surveillance expedition. Nancy listened without interrupting, her expression growing darker with each detail. I'm sorry, she said when I finished. I'm sorry you're going through this. And I'm sorry Richard turned out to be exactly the kind of man I was worried about when you first started dating him. You were worried about him? Nancy sighed. Caroline, you're brilliant, successful, and kind. You could have had anyone. Richard always seemed like he was trying to diminish you, to make himself feel bigger by making you feel smaller. I hoped. I was wrong, but this confirms what I've suspected for years. Her words hit harder than I expected. If Nancy had seen these patterns, how many other people had noticed things I'd been blind to? How long had I been making excuses for behavior that was actually inexcusable? What are you going to do? Nancy asked. I'm working with a divorce, attorney, I said. We're preparing to file, but we're waiting for the right moment. Good, Nancy said firmly. And when the time comes, I'll be there for whatever you need. Character witness, emotional support, help moving his stuff to the curb, whatever it takes. That weekend, Richard announced his San Francisco business trip. I'll be gone from Thursday through Sunday, he said. Michael found some promising properties, and we want to move quickly on the deals. I nodded and wished him a safe trip, all while knowing this was likely his plan to spend a long weekend with his girlfriend without the stress of maintaining his cover story. The thought of them playing house together, probably laughing about how easily they were deceiving me, made my stomach turn. But it also crystallized my resolve. Richard thought. He was controlling the narrative, managing his exit from our marriage on his terms. He believed he could dictate the timing and the conditions of our separation. What he didn't realize was that I'd been several steps ahead of him for weeks. The Thursday morning of his departure, I watched him pack his suitcase with unusual care. He included clothes I'd never seen him take on business trips, his best cologne, and even the expensive watch I'd given him for his last birthday. This wasn't a man preparing for business meetings. This was a man preparing for a romantic getaway. After he left, I sat in our empty house and felt the full weight of what was ending. 18 years of marriage, of building a life together, of shared dreams and plans. The house around me was full of memories, from the kitchen where we'd hosted dinner parties to the backyard where we'd talked about maybe getting a dog someday. But alongside the grief, there was something else. Relief. The pretending was almost over. Soon, I wouldn't have to smile when Richard kissed my cheek, knowing he'd been kissing someone else. I wouldn't have to listen to his elaborate lies or watch him check his phone constantly for messages from his girlfriend. The emotional exhaustion of living with deception was about to end. That evening, I met with Thomas Bradford one final time, before we implemented our plan. Are you ready for this? He asked. Once we file, there's no going back. Richard is going to be shocked, angry, and probably vindictive. I'm ready, I said. But there's something else I want to do first. I want to meet her. Thomas looked surprised. Caroline, I wouldn't recommend confronting the other woman. It rarely goes well, and it could complicate our case. Not confronting, I clarified. I want to understand who she is, what she knows about the situation. If she's as young and naive as she seems, she might not fully understand what she's gotten herself into. The plan we developed was simple. I'd approach Brittany Hayes, the young woman Richard was involved with, under the pretense of being a potential client for her marketing services. I'd discovered through social media that she worked as a freelance social media manager for small businesses. It would give me a chance to assess her character and possibly learn more about her relationship with Richard. The meeting was scheduled for Tuesday at a coffee shop near her apartment. I spent Monday rehearsing my cover story and preparing for what would likely be a difficult conversation. I wasn't sure what I hoped to accomplish, but I needed to look this woman in the eye and understand what had been worth destroying my marriage for. As I prepared for bed Monday night, I thought about how dramatically my life had changed in just a few weeks. A month ago, I'd been a married woman with a stable, if somewhat stagnant, life. Now I was preparing to divorce my husband, confront his girlfriend, and start over at 45. The woman who had overheard that phone conversation and felt her world crashing down was gone. In her place was someone harder, more strategic, more willing to fight for what she deserved. Richard had always underestimated me, seeing me as the accommodating wife who would support his decisions and adapt to his needs. He was about to discover just how wrong he'd been about the woman he'd married. Tuesday morning arrived with the kind of crisp October air that made Portland feel alive with possibility. I dressed carefully for my meeting with Brittany Hayes, choosing a professional but approachable outfit that would help me blend into the coffee shop environment without standing out as someone who clearly didn't belong in her world. Navy blazer, dark jeans, minimal jewelry. I wanted to look like a small business owner who might genuinely need social media marketing services. The coffee shop she'd suggested was in the Pearl District, a trendy area filled with converted warehouses, art galleries, and the kind of independent businesses that attracted young professionals like Brittany. I arrived 15 minutes early, claiming a corner table with good sightlines to the entrance. My hands trembled slightly as I ordered a latte, the reality of what I was about to do hitting me fully. When Brittany walked in, I recognized her, immediately from my surveillance night. But seeing her up close was somehow more jarring. She was even younger than I'd estimated, with that fresh-faced confidence that comes from believing the world is full of opportunities waiting to be seized. Her blonde hair was styled in loose waves, and she wore a flowing bohemian dress with ankle boots that probably cost more than most people's monthly grocery budget. Everything about her screamed privilege and naivety. She scanned the coffee shop and spotted me approaching with a bright smile and an outstretched hand. "Caroline? I'm Brittany. Thanks so much for reaching out about your marketing needs." Her handshake was firm, her eye contact direct. Whatever else she might be, she wasn't lacking in professional confidence. We settled into our seats, and I watched her pull out a sleek laptop and a notebook filled with colorful pens and sticky notes. The organization reminded me of myself at her age, when I'd been building my first business and everything had seemed possible. "So tell me about your consulting firm," Brittany said, her voice warm and genuinely interested. "What kind of clients do you typically work with?" I launched into my prepared story about wanting to expand my marketing consultancy's social media presence, focusing on LinkedIn and Instagram strategies for reaching corporate clients. Brittany listened intently, asking intelligent questions and taking detailed notes. She was clearly good at her job, which made the situation even more complicated. As she talked about content calendars and engagement strategies, I found myself studying her face for any hint that she knew who I was. Did Richard ever mention his wife? Had he shown her pictures of me? Did she know she was sitting across from the woman whose life she was helping to destroy? "Your business sounds really established," Brittany said, glancing up from her notes. "How long have you been running it?" "About 12 years, I replied, which was true if you counted from when I'd formalized the consultancy after my startup sale. It's been quite a journey, building something from the ground up. "I can imagine," she said, her voice taking on a slightly wistful tone. "Sometimes I wonder what it would be like to have that kind of stability and success. The freelance life can be pretty unpredictable." There was something vulnerable in her admission that caught me off guard. I'd expected to find a calculating homewrecker, someone who had deliberately set out to seduce a married man for his money. Instead, I was looking at a young woman who seemed genuinely uncertain about her future, perhaps attracted to the security that an older, established man like Richard could offer. "What got you into social media marketing?" I asked, genuinely curious now. Brittany's face lit up. "I studied communications in college, but I really fell into this by accident. I was helping a friend promote her jewelry business on Instagram, and her sales took off. Word spread, and suddenly I had more clients than I could handle." She paused, her expression growing more serious. "The income is good when things are going well, but there's no safety net. No benefits, no guaranteed paycheck. Sometimes I think about what it would be like to have a more traditional life, you know? Someone to share the responsibility with." The irony was almost painful. Here was a young woman yearning for exactly the kind of stability and partnership I'd thought I had with Richard. She had no idea that the man promising her security was about to lose a significant portion of his assets and income. She didn't know that his real estate business was more leveraged than profitable, or that his current lifestyle was largely dependent on the wealth I'd brought to our marriage. Relationships can definitely provide stability, I said carefully. Are you seeing anyone seriously? A soft smile crossed her face, the kind of expression I remembered wearing when Richard and I were first together. Actually, yes. It's still pretty new, but he's amazing. Older, more established, really successful in real estate. He makes me feel like I could have the kind of life I've always dreamed about. The casual way she mentioned his profession confirmed what I already knew. But hearing her talk about Richard with such genuine affection was more painful than I'd anticipated. She wasn't just some opportunistic young woman looking for a sugar daddy. She was genuinely smitten, probably believing she'd found her fairy tale ending. That sounds wonderful, I managed. How did you meet? At a real estate open house, actually, she said, her cheeks flushing slightly. I was looking at apartments in Forest Hills, way outside my budget, but fun to dream about. He was the listing agent, and we just clicked immediately. He's so sophisticated, so different from the guys my age who are still figuring out what they want to do with their lives. Forest Hills, our neighborhood. The realization that Richard had been using our community, possibly even our own home, as hunting grounds for his affair made my stomach turn. How many other young women had he approached at open houses? How long had this been going on? Forest Hills is beautiful, I said, proud of how steady my voice remained. Very expensive, though. I know, right? But Richard says he knows the market really well, might be able to help me find something I could actually afford. He's been so generous with his time and advice. Richard. She'd said his name. The confirmation hit me like a physical blow, even though I'd known what I'd find when I arranged this meeting. Hearing her speak his name with such fondness, seeing the way her eyes softened when she talked about him, made the betrayal feel fresh and raw all over again. He sounds like quite a catch, I said, and the words tasted bitter in my mouth. He really is, Brittany agreed. The only complicated part is that he's going through a divorce right now. It's been really hard on him, dealing with an ex-wife who's being difficult about the settlement. But he says it should all be finalized soon, and then we can really start building something together. The narrative Richard had constructed for her was masterful in its manipulation. I wasn't a devoted wife of 18 years being betrayed and abandoned. I was a difficult ex-wife making unreasonable demands. He'd rewritten our entire history to cast himself as the victim and me as the obstacle to his happiness. Divorce can be complicated, I said, fighting to keep my voice neutral, especially when there are significant assets involved. That's exactly what Richard says, Brittany nodded. His wife apparently thinks she's entitled to half of everything he's built, even though she didn't really contribute much to his success. He's been so stressed about the whole thing, but he says his lawyer is confident they can reach a fair settlement. Fair settlement. The phrase almost made me laugh. Richard had no idea what fair actually looked like according to our prenuptial agreement. He was so confident in his understanding of our financial situation that he hadn't bothered to review the document that would determine his fate. It must be difficult for both of you, I said. Starting a new relationship while dealing with legal complications. It is, Brittany admitted. Sometimes I wonder if I should step back and let him handle everything before we get more serious. But he keeps telling me that I'm what's keeping him sane through all of this. He says I remind him what happiness looks like. The manipulation was so textbook it was almost impressive. Richard was using the classic tactic of making himself indispensable to her emotional well-being, while positioning their relationship as his salvation from his terrible marriage. Brittany had no way of knowing that every late night he spent comforting Her about their uncertain future. He was lying in bed next to his wife, who had no idea her marriage was ending. We spent another hour discussing social media strategies, with Brittany providing genuinely helpful insights and suggestions. She was intelligent, creative, and hardworking. Under different circumstances, I might have actually hired her. The thought made the whole situation even more tragic. This young woman was about to have her world destroyed by a man who saw her as nothing more than an ego boost and a sexual conquest. As our meeting wound down, I found myself in an unexpected position. I'd come here to gather intelligence about my husband's mistress, expecting to find someone I could easily dismiss or hate. Instead, I'd discovered a decent person who was being deceived as thoroughly as I had been, just in different ways. "This has been really helpful," I said as Brittany packed up her materials. "Can I think about everything we've discussed and get back to you?" "Of course," she said, handing me her business card. "And Caroline, thanks for giving a freelancer a chance. A lot of established businesses prefer to work with big agencies, so I really appreciate you considering me." Her gratitude made me feel sick. She was thanking me for my time while unknowingly dating my husband. The whole situation was so surreal I almost felt like I was watching it happen to someone else. Walking back to my car, I called Thomas Bradford's office and scheduled an emergency meeting. The conversation with Brittany had changed something fundamental about my approach to this divorce. This wasn't just about protecting my assets or getting revenge on Richard anymore. It was about making sure that when the truth came out, Brittany understood exactly what kind of man she'd fallen for. That afternoon, sitting in Thomas's office, I shared everything I'd learned from my coffee shop reconnaissance mission. Thomas listened with the patient expression of someone who'd heard every possible variation of infidelity and deception. "So she has no idea Richard is still married," he summarized when I finished. "She believes he's separated and going through divorce proceedings." "Exactly," I confirmed. "And she has no understanding of his real financial situation. She thinks he's this successful real estate mogul who can solve all her problems." Thomas leaned back in his chair, considering the implications. "This actually strengthens our position significantly. If we can prove that Richard has been cohabitating with another woman while still married to you, it violates the faithfulness clause in your prenup even more clearly than simple adultery." "What about Brittany?" I asked. "She's going to be collateral damage in all this." Thomas's expression softened slightly. "Caroline, I understand your concern for this young woman, but she's not your responsibility. Richard chose to deceive both of you. When the truth comes out, she'll have to deal with the consequences of his lies, just like you're dealing with them now." I knew Thomas was right from a legal standpoint, but something about the situation bothered me. Brittany was about to learn that the man she'd fallen for was a liar and a cheat, that the future she'd been dreaming about was built on deception. While Richard deserved whatever consequences came his way, she was genuinely innocent in all this. The rest of the week passed. In a strange haze of normalcy, Richard returned from his San Francisco trip full of stories about property deals and business meetings, never mentioning that I'd spent Tuesday morning having coffee with his girlfriend. I nodded and asked appropriate questions, all while knowing that every word out of his mouth was carefully constructed fiction. On Friday night, we had dinner with Michael Sterling and his wife at their usual table at the Glass House, an upscale restaurant downtown that had become our regular spot for business socializing. Michael and Richard discussed potential investments, while I made polite conversation with Helen Sterling about her volunteer work at the art museum. Watching Richard perform the role of devoted husband was fascinating in its thoroughness. He held my hand during dinner, laughed at my jokes, and included me in conversations about future travel plans we'd never take together. If I hadn't known better, I would have believed we were a happily married couple enjoying an evening with friends. The performance became even more elaborate when Michael brought up the topic of expansion. "Richard's been telling me about some opportunities in the Bay Area," he said. We're thinking about opening a satellite office. Maybe Richard's spending half his time down there to get things established." "That sounds exciting," I said, looking at Richard with what I hoped passed for supportive enthusiasm. "When would something like that start?" "Soon," Richard replied, squeezing my hand. "Maybe after the first of the year. It would mean some travel initially, but it could really pay off in the long term." The plan was becoming clearer. Richard intended to establish himself in San Francisco, probably moving Brittany there with him, while maintaining the fiction that it was for business purposes. He was laying groundwork for a geographic separation that would make his eventual divorce filing seem natural rather than sudden. Sunday morning brought an unexpected development. Richard announced that he needed to show a property in Lake Oswego, a wealthy suburb south of Portland, and might be gone most of the day. "High-end client," he explained. "Could be a really significant commission if this works out." After he left, I called Nancy and asked if she wanted to meet for brunch. I needed to talk to someone who knew me well enough to help me process everything that was happening. We met at a quiet restaurant in the Hawthorne district, far enough from our usual haunts that we were unlikely to run into anyone we knew. "You look different," Nancy said as soon as we sat down. "Not bad different, just more intense somehow." "I've been busy," I said, and proceeded to tell her about my meeting with Brittany and everything I'd learned about Richard's deception. Nancy listened with growing outrage, her breakfast growing cold as I shared the details of Richard's elaborate lies. "That manipulative bastard," she said when I finished. "He's not just cheating on you, he's completely gaslighting this poor girl about your entire marriage." "I know," I said, "and the worst part is, she genuinely cares about him. She's not some gold digger looking for a meal ticket. She actually believes they have a future together." "Caroline," Nancy said carefully, "I can see you're struggling with this, but you can't save everyone. Richard created this mess, and he's going to have to live with the consequences." "I'm not trying to save everyone," I replied. "I just want to make sure that when this all comes out, it comes out completely. No more lies, no more deception, no more letting Richard control the narrative." Nancy studied my face with the kind of attention that comes from decades of friendship. "What are you planning?" "Something that's going to change everything," I said, "but I need to make sure I'm ready for what comes next." That afternoon, I spent several hours in my home office, reviewing financial documents and creating detailed spreadsheets of our assets and debts. The picture that emerged was even more favorable to my position than I'd initially realized. Richard's real estate business was carrying significant debt, secured by properties that had declined in value over the past year. Meanwhile, my investment portfolio had continued to grow steadily, even through the recent market volatility. The irony was profound. While Richard believed he was preparing to leave me for a more exciting life with a younger woman, he was actually planning to abandon the source of his financial stability for a relationship built on lies he'd eventually be unable to maintain. Monday morning brought a phone call that would accelerate everything. Thomas Bradford's office called to inform me that Richard had contacted a divorce attorney. My husband was finally ready to make his move, but he was about to discover that I'd been several moves ahead of him all along. "What do you want to do?" Thomas asked during our emergency meeting that afternoon. "We could file first, maintain the element of surprise." "Not yet," I said. "Let him think he's controlling the timeline. I want to see exactly what he's planning, what story he intends to tell, what he thinks he's entitled to take from our marriage." "Caroline," Thomas warned, "the longer we wait, the more opportunity he has to hide assets or create complications." "He won't hide anything," I said with more confidence than I felt. "He doesn't think he needs to. Richard believes he understands our financial situation better than I do. He has no idea what he's really walking away from." That evening, Richard came home with an unusual lightness in his step. He was humming while he made dinner, more animated than I'd seen him in months. The paperwork for his divorce consultation was probably sitting in his briefcase, representing what he saw as the first step toward his new life. "Good day?" I asked, watching him chop vegetables with unusual enthusiasm. "Very good," he said. "Some new opportunities opening up. Big changes on the horizon." "What kind of changes?" Richard paused in his chopping, and for a moment I thought he might actually tell me the truth. Instead, he smiled and resumed his work. "Business stuff. Mainly. Just feeling optimistic about the future." As I watched my husband prepare our dinner while planning our divorce, I realized how completely our marriage had become a performance. We were both playing roles now, both maintaining elaborate fictions, both preparing for a battle the other didn't know was coming. The difference was that Richard thought he was the only one with a strategy. He believed he was the puppet master pulling strings while I remained obliviously caught up in domestic routines. What he didn't realize was that I'd been preparing for this confrontation longer than he'd been planning his escape. Wednesday brought the confirmation I'd been expecting. Richard announced another business trip, this time to Sacramento, leaving Thursday and returning Sunday. The pattern was becoming predictable. Long weekends away, elaborate cover stories, and the careful cultivation of his double life. But this trip would be different. This time, I wouldn't be sitting at home wondering what he was really doing or who he was with. This time, I'd be using his absence to implement the final phases of my own strategy. Thursday morning, I watched Richard pack his bags with the same careful attention to appearance I'd noticed before. As his car disappeared down our street, I picked up my phone and called Thomas Bradford. "It's time," I said. "File the papers, and make sure a copy is delivered to his girlfriend's apartment. She deserves to know what kind of man she's fallen in love with." The next phase of this battle was about to begin, and Richard had no idea that his carefully constructed house of lies was about to come crashing down around him. The divorce papers were filed at 9:47 a.m. on Friday morning. By 11:30 a.m., a process server had delivered copies to Richard's office, his business partner Michael Sterling, and Brittany Hayes at her Pearl District apartment. I'd specifically requested that all 3 deliveries happen simultaneously, ensuring that Richard's carefully compartmentalized world would collide all at once. I spent that Friday morning at Copper Moon Cafe, the same place where I'd confided in Nancy weeks earlier, waiting for the phone calls that would inevitably come. My lawyer had advised me to make myself available, but not to reach out to anyone directly. "Let them process the shock," he'd said. "Let them make the first move." The first call came at 12:15 p.m. Michael Sterling's name appeared on my phone screen, and I almost didn't answer. Michael had been Richard's business partner for 8 years, but he'd also been a friend to both of us. Or so I'd thought. "Caroline," Michael's voice was strained when I picked up. "What the hell is going on? I just had some guy serve me with papers saying you're divorcing Richard and claiming he's been embezzling from the business." "I'm not claiming anything, Michael," I said calmly. "I'm stating facts that my attorney will prove in court." "Did you know about Brittany?" The silence that followed was answer enough. "Michael, did you know my husband was having an affair?" "Caroline, it's not my place to get involved in your marriage." "That's interesting," I said, my voice remaining steady despite the anger building inside me. "Because according to these financial records I've been reviewing, you've been involved in helping Richard hide income and restructure assets for months. That sounds pretty involved to me." Another silence, longer this time. "I think you should talk to Richard," Michael finally said. "I think Richard should talk to his attorney," I replied. "And Michael, you might want to call yours too." I hung up before he could respond. Michael's evasiveness confirmed what I'd suspected. Richard hadn't been planning this exit alone. He'd had help, probably professional help, in preparing to leave our marriage with as much of our shared wealth as possible. The second call came 20 minutes later. This time, it was a number I didn't recognize. "Is this Caroline Weber?" The voice was young, female, and shaking. "This is Caroline. This is Brittany Hayes. I think we need to talk." The coffee shop she suggested was different from where we'd met before, a small place in southeast Portland that felt appropriately neutral territory for what was about to be a very difficult conversation. I arrived first, choosing a table in the back corner where we could speak privately. Brittany looked completely different from the confident young professional I'd met. Just days earlier, her hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, her eyes were red from crying, and she clutched a crumpled tissue in one hand. The divorce papers sat on the table in front of her, obviously read and reread multiple times. "You're his wife," she said as soon as I sat down. It wasn't a question. "Yes." "And you knew who I was when we met earlier this week?" "Yes." Brittany stared at me for a long moment, and I could see her trying to process the implications of our previous conversation. Everything I'd said, every question I'd asked, now took on a different meaning. "How long have you known?" she asked. "About you specifically? A few weeks? About Richard having an affair? Longer." "Why didn't you just confront me then? Why the charade with the marketing consultation?" I considered the question carefully. The answer was complicated, involving my own need to understand who this woman was and what she knew about the situation she'd gotten involved in. "I needed to know if you were a victim or a participant," I said finally. "If you knew Richard was married and chose to be with him anyway, or if he'd lied to you the way he'd been lying to me." Brittany's face crumpled slightly. "He told me you were separated. He said the divorce was already in progress, that you were just being difficult about the financial settlement." "We were never separated, Brittany. Richard has been living with me, sleeping in our bed, having dinner with our friends, right up until he left for Sacramento yesterday." The information hit her like a physical blow. She doubled over slightly, one hand pressed to her stomach, as if she might be sick. "Oh God," she whispered. "Oh God, what have I done?" "You fell for the lies of a very convincing man," I said, and I meant it. "Richard is excellent at telling people what they want to hear." "But I should have known," she said, tears flowing freely now. "I should have asked more questions, insisted on meeting you, something. I've been sleeping with a married man for months." "You've been sleeping with a man who told you he was getting divorced," I corrected. "That's not the same thing." Brittany looked up at me with an expression of confused gratitude. "Why are you being kind to me? I've been destroying your marriage." "Richard destroyed our marriage," I said firmly. "You were just the weapon he chose to do it with." We sat in silence for several minutes while Brittany processed what she'd learned. Finally, she spoke again. "The apartment he's been helping me look at in Forest Hills, is that near where you live?" "It's my neighborhood, yes." "And the business trip to San Francisco last month?" "He told me it was for work. I assume he was with you." Brittany nodded miserably. "We went apartment hunting. He said he was thinking about opening a branch office there, that I could move with him and start fresh somewhere new." The picture was becoming clearer. Richard hadn't just been having an affair. He'd been building an entire alternate life, complete with geographic relocation and career changes for both of them. The level of planning and deception was breathtaking in its scope. "Brittany," I said gently, "I need you to know that Richard doesn't have the money he's been telling you he has. Our prenuptial agreement includes specific penalties for infidelity, and his real estate business is heavily leveraged. Whatever future he's been promising you isn't financially possible." "I don't care about the money," she said quickly, then paused. "I mean, I do care, but not the way you probably think. It wasn't about wanting him to support me. It was about feeling like I could finally relax, you know? Like I wouldn't have to worry about making rent every month or whether I'd have enough clients to pay my bills." Her honesty was heartbreaking. Brittany hadn't been looking for a sugar daddy. She'd been looking for security, for the kind of stability that Richard had seemed to offer. The fact that his promises were built on lies and stolen from another woman's life made the deception even more cruel. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now, Richard comes home from his fake business trip to discover that his double life has been exposed," I said. "And you decide what you want to do with the information you have about who he really is." "I can't see him again," Brittany said immediately. "I can't be with someone who could lie like that. But Caroline, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry for what I've done to your life." "You didn't do anything to my life, Brittany. Richard did. And honestly, he may have done me a favor. I've learned things about myself in the past few weeks that I might never have discovered otherwise." After Brittany left, I drove home to an empty house that felt different than it had just hours before. The silence wasn't oppressive anymore. It was peaceful. For the first time in months, I wasn't waiting for Richard to come home, wasn't preparing to smile and pretend that everything was normal. Saturday passed quietly. I spent the morning cleaning out closets, sorting through 18 years of accumulated possessions and deciding what belonged to me alone. It was therapeutic work, reclaiming space that had been shared for so long. Nancy stopped by in the afternoon with groceries and moral support. "How are you holding up?" she asked, unpacking ingredients for what looked like enough soup to feed a small army. "Better than I expected," I said honestly. "It's strange, but I feel more like myself than I have in years." "That's because you're finally allowed to stop pretending," Nancy said. "You've been managing Richard's ego and emotions for so long that you probably forgot what it felt like to just be Caroline." Her observation hit closer to home than I'd realized. How much of my identity had become wrapped up in being Richard's wife, in supporting his career and social aspirations. How many of my own dreams and ambitions had I set aside to make room for his? Sunday morning brought the call I'd been expecting. Richard's name appeared on my phone at 8:23 a.m., just as I was finishing my coffee and scanning the newspaper. "Caroline." His voice was tight with barely controlled fury. "We need to talk." "Good morning, Richard. How was Sacramento?" "Cut." "The shit. I know you filed for divorce. I know you've been talking to Brittany. I want to know what the hell you think you're doing." "I'm ending our marriage," I said calmly. I thought that would be obvious from the divorce papers. "This is insane, Caroline. You can't just blow up our entire life because you're having some kind of midlife crisis." The accusation was so perfectly Richard. My discovery of his affair and decision to leave him wasn't a rational response to his betrayal. It was a midlife crisis, an irrational female overreaction that could be managed and controlled. "I'm not blowing up our life, Richard. You already did that when you decided to move in with a 26-year-old. "I haven't moved in with anyone," he said, but the denial lacked conviction. "Richard, I've seen you at her apartment. I've watched you pack clothes for romantic weekends while telling me you were traveling for business. I've documented months of lies and deception. Don't insult my intelligence by pretending this is all in my imagination." The silence that followed was different from the pauses in our earlier conversations. This wasn't Richard calculating his next move. This was the silence of someone realizing that their carefully constructed narrative had completely collapsed. "Fine," he said finally. "So I've been seeing someone. That doesn't give you the right to try to destroy me financially." "I'm not trying to destroy you financially, Richard. I'm exercising the terms of the prenuptial agreement that you insisted we sign." "What are you talking about?" "The infidelity clause, Richard. Section 7, subsection C. In the event that either party engages in extramarital relations, the unfaithful spouse forfeits their claim to any premarital assets of the faithful spouse and is responsible for compensatory damages." Another silence, longer this time. "That's not what the prenup says," Richard said, but his voice had lost its earlier confidence. "Richard, when was the last time you actually read our prenuptial agreement?" "I don't need to read it. I know what it says." No, you know what you thought it said 18 years ago. You never bothered to review it because you assumed you understood it. Just like you assumed you understood our financial situation. What's that supposed to mean? It means you have no idea what you're actually walking away from, I said. And you have no idea what you're about to lose. Richard's breathing was audible through the phone. I could practically hear him calculating, trying to remember details from a document he'd signed nearly 2 decades earlier. "I'm coming home," he said finally. "We're going to sort this out." "That's fine," I said. "But Richard, I won't be here. I'm spending the day with my attorney, and I suggest you do the same." I hung up before he could respond, then immediately called Thomas Bradford's emergency line. If Richard was coming back early and angry, I wanted to make sure all our preparations were in place. Thomas answered on the second ring. "Caroline, how are things going?" "Richard just called. He's coming home, and he's not happy. I think we need to accelerate our timeline." "Agreed. Can you meet me at my office in an hour? We need to prepare for what's likely to be a very aggressive response from his legal team." The drive to Thomas's office gave me time to think about how dramatically my life had changed in just a few days. On Friday morning, I'd been a woman planning her divorce in secret. By Sunday afternoon, I was actively engaged in legal warfare with a husband who finally understood that he'd underestimated his opponent. Thomas's office was bustling with weekend activity. Paralegals were reviewing documents, associates were researching case law, and Thomas himself was coordinating what looked like a major campaign rather than a simple divorce proceeding. "Richard's attorney called my office 3 times yesterday," Thomas told me as we settled into his conference room. "James Morrison from Morrison, Walsh and Associates. He's expensive, aggressive, and he specializes in high-asset divorces." "Should I be worried?" "Not at all," Thomas said with a slight smile. "Morrison is good at what he does, but he's used to cases where both parties are starting from roughly equal positions. He's not prepared for a situation where one spouse holds all, the leverage from the beginning." Thomas spread several documents across the conference table. Financial statements, property records, business valuations, and a detailed analysis of Richard's debt-to-asset ratio. "The picture is even clearer now that we've had time to do a complete analysis," Thomas explained. "Richard's real estate business is carrying nearly $3 million in debt, secured by properties that have declined in value significantly over the past 18 months. Meanwhile, your investment portfolio is worth approximately $2.8 million, all of which is protected under the prenup as premarital assets. What does that mean in practical terms? It means that if Richard follows through with this divorce, he'll be walking away with his business debts, his personal belongings, and whatever assets we can't prove were acquired using your premarital funds. Meanwhile, you'll retain all of your investments, your consulting business, and your claim to compensatory damages for his infidelity." The numbers were staggering. Richard had been so focused on what he saw as his successful real estate career that he'd never bothered to understand the true financial foundation of our lifestyle. The house we lived in, the cars we drove, the country club membership he valued. So highly, all of it had been purchased with money that legally belonged to me alone. "There's something else," Thomas continued. "We've discovered some irregularities in Richard's business accounting. It appears he's been using joint marital funds to cover business expenses without documenting them as loans to the company." "What kind of irregularities?" "Transfers from your joint savings account to cover payroll, property maintenance, and equipment purchases for Weber and Associates. Under Oregon law, any marital funds used for business purposes must be properly documented and can be claimed as marital assets subject to division." The implications were enormous. Not only had Richard been stealing from our marriage to fund his affair, he'd been stealing from our marriage to keep his business afloat. The man who'd accused me of not contributing to his success had actually been subsidizing his career with my money. How much are we talking about? Thomas consulted his notes. Approximately $400,000 over the past 3 years. All transfers that should have been structured as business loans, but were instead treated as gifts. So he owes me $400,000? Plus interest, plus the compensatory damages from the infidelity clause, plus his share of any increase in value of assets purchased with your premarital funds. The scope of Richard's financial exposure was breathtaking. He'd walked into this divorce believing he was the wealthy spouse leaving his dependent wife. Instead, he was about to discover that he was the dependent spouse who'd been living off his wife's money while cheating on her. Monday morning brought a flurry of activity. Richard's attorney filed several motions challenging the validity of our prenuptial agreement, requesting emergency spousal support, and seeking to freeze all marital assets pending litigation. Thomas had anticipated every one of these moves and filed counter motions that turned each of Richard's strategies against him. The emergency hearing was scheduled for Wednesday afternoon. 3 days to prepare for what would essentially be the opening battle in what promised to be a very expensive war. Tuesday evening, Richard showed up at our house. I watched him pull into the driveway from my office window, noting that he was alone. Apparently, his romantic getaway with Brittany had been cut short by the reality of his legal situation. I met him at the front door, not because I wanted to talk to him, but because I didn't want him to think he could still treat our home as his personal space. "Caroline," he said, and his voice was different. Gone was the angry bluster from our phone conversation. In its place was something that sounded almost like pleading. "Richard, can we talk? Really talk, without lawyers and accusations and all this legal nonsense?" "I don't think that's a good idea. Please, just give me 5 minutes to explain what happened, to help you understand that this doesn't have to destroy everything we've built together." The request was so perfectly manipulative that I almost admired its construction. Richard was positioning himself as the reasonable party, the one willing to communicate and compromise, while casting me as the stubborn spouse letting lawyers escalate the situation unnecessarily. "Okay," I said, stepping aside to let him enter. 5 minutes. We sat in our living room, in the same chairs where we'd entertained friends and discussed our future together. Richard looked older than I remembered, stress and sleepless nights having aged him visibly in just a few days. "I made a mistake," he began. "A terrible mistake, and I'm sorry. But Caroline, we can fix this. We can go to counseling, work through our problems, rebuild what we had." "What we had was built on lies, Richard. You've been deceiving me for months." "The thing with Brittany got out of hand," he said, as if their relationship had been some kind of accident. "I never meant for it to go as far as it did. She's young, she was going through a difficult time, and I let my ego get involved when I should have maintained professional boundaries." The narrative he was constructing was masterful. Brittany became a vulnerable client who'd manipulated his sympathetic nature. Their affair became a momentary lapse in judgment rather than a calculated betrayal. Richard positioned himself as the victim of his own compassion. "Richard, you've been planning to leave me for months. You've been hiding money, making travel arrangements, setting up a new life in San Francisco. This wasn't a momentary lapse. This was a systematic plan to abandon our marriage." "That's not true," he said, but the denial lacked conviction. "I was exploring business opportunities, yes, but I never intended to leave you." "You packed your best clothes for every trip. You bought her jewelry. You were looking at apartments together. Stop lying to me, Richard. You've already lost the right to my trust. Don't make it worse by insulting my intelligence." Richard was quiet for a long moment, apparently realizing that his usual manipulation tactics weren't working. When he spoke, again, his voice had changed. "Fine," he said. "Maybe I was thinking about leaving. Maybe things between us haven't been great for a while. But Caroline, you can't seriously think you're going to take everything I've worked for my entire life. I'm not taking anything, Richard. I'm keeping what was always mine. That's bullshit, and you know it. We built this life together. We built this life with my money, I said quietly. Money you apparently forgot came from me. The truth hung in the air between us like a blade. Richard stared at me as if seeing me clearly for the first time in years. Wednesday's hearing is going to be very educational for you, I continued. You're going to learn exactly what our prenuptial agreement says, exactly where our money came from, and exactly what your affair is going to cost you. Richard stood up abruptly, his 5 minutes having turned into a conversation that demolished every assumption he'd made about our divorce. This isn't over, Caroline, he said as he headed for the door. No, I agreed. But it will be soon. After he left, I poured myself a glass of wine and sat in the silence of what was no longer our home. Tomorrow would bring new battles, new revelations, new challenges. But tonight, for the first time in months, I felt completely at peace with the choices I'd made. Richard had gambled everything on the assumption that he understood the game we were playing better than I did. Wednesday's hearing would reveal just how wrong he'd been. Wednesday morning arrived with the crisp clarity of a reckoning long overdue. I dressed in my most professional navy suit, the one I'd worn to close my biggest consulting deals, and arrived at the Multnomah County Courthouse 30 minutes early. The building buzzed with the usual mixture of human drama and bureaucratic efficiency that characterizes family court. But today felt different. Today, 18 years of marriage would be distilled down to legal arguments and financial evidence. Thomas Bradford met me in the hallway outside courtroom 4B, carrying 2 briefcases and wearing the expression of a man who'd spent the previous evening preparing for battle. "Are you ready for this?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "I've been ready for weeks," I replied, and meant it. Richard arrived 10 minutes before the hearing was scheduled to begin, flanked by his attorney James Morrison and looking like a man who'd aged a decade in the past few days. Morrison was exactly what I'd expected based on his reputation. Expensive suit, silver hair, and the kind of predatory confidence that comes from winning ugly divorces for wealthy clients. He barely glanced in my direction, which told me everything I needed to know about his strategy. He was still treating this as a standard high-asset divorce where the primary breadwinner would protect his wealth from his dependent spouse. Judge Patricia Chen took the bench at exactly 2 p.m., her expression neutral but alert. She'd been handling family law cases for over 15 years, and Thomas had briefed me that she had little patience for theatrics or time-wasting maneuvers. "This is an emergency hearing regarding the divorce petition of Caroline Weber versus Richard Weber," Judge Chen announced. "Mr. Morrison, I understand you filed several motions challenging the validity of the prenuptial agreement and requesting emergency relief." Morrison stood with the theatrical flourish of a man accustomed to commanding courtrooms. "Yes, Your Honor. My client is the victim of a coordinated attack designed to strip him of assets he's spent nearly 2 decades accumulating. The prenuptial agreement in question was signed under duress, contains unconscionable provisions, and should be declared invalid. Furthermore, Mrs. Weber's attempts to freeze marital assets and claim sole ownership of property acquired during the marriage represents an abuse of the legal system. The opening was perfectly crafted to position Richard as the wronged party, but I could see Judge Chen's expression growing skeptical as Morrison continued his dramatic presentation. Thomas had warned me that Morrison's reputation was built more on intimidation than substance, and judges like Chen had seen enough of his grandstanding to be immune to its effects. "Mr. Bradford," Judge Chen said when Morrison finished, "I assume you have a response?" Thomas rose with none of Morrison's theatrical energy, but his presence commanded the courtroom in a different way. "Your Honor, every assertion made by opposing counsel is contradicted by the evidence. The prenuptial agreement was negotiated over several months with independent counsel for both parties." Mrs. Weber's premarital assets are clearly documented and have been consistently maintained as separate property throughout the marriage. Most importantly, Mr. Weber's infidelity is thoroughly documented and triggers specific provisions in the prenuptial agreement that he negotiated and signed. Judge Chen leaned forward slightly. Mr. Morrison, are you disputing that your client engaged in an extramarital relationship? Morrison shifted uncomfortably. Your Honor, any personal relationships my client may have developed occurred after the marriage had irretrievably broken down. Mrs. Weber had already emotionally abandoned the marriage, creating circumstances that led to its natural dissolution. The argument was creative but legally meaningless. Oregon was a no-fault divorce state, but the prenuptial agreement created specific consequences for adultery, regardless of the emotional state of the marriage. Mr. Bradford, I'd like to review the prenuptial agreement in question, Judge Chen said. Thomas approached the bench with a copy of the document, and I watched Richard's face as the judge began reading. For the first time since this process began, he looked genuinely uncertain. Morrison leaned over to whisper something in his ear, but Richard shook his head, his expression growing increasingly pale. This is quite comprehensive, Judge Chen observed after several minutes of reading. Section 7, subsection C clearly states that infidelity voids any claim to premarital assets and triggers compensatory damages. Mr. Morrison, on what basis are you claiming this provision is unconscionable? Your Honor, the penalties are disproportionate to the alleged breach. Furthermore, the definition of infidelity is overly broad and could encompass innocent social interactions. Thomas stood immediately. Your Honor, if I may, we have extensive documentation proving that Mr. Weber has been cohabitating with another woman for several months while representing to her that he was separated from his wife. This goes far beyond innocent social interaction. I'd like to see that documentation, Judge Chen said. What followed was the systematic destruction of every lie Richard had constructed over the past 6 months. Thomas presented bank records showing Richard had used marital funds to pay for hotel rooms, jewelry, and travel expenses for his relationship with Brittany. He showed phone records documenting hundreds of calls and text messages. He presented photographs of Richard entering and leaving Brittany's apartment at all hours. But the most damaging evidence was Brittany's sworn affidavit, which Thomas had obtained the previous day. In careful legal language, she described how Richard had told her he was separated, how he'd promised her a future together, and how she'd only learned he was still living with his wife when the divorce papers were served. Morrison objected, repeatedly, but each objection only highlighted how thoroughly Richard's deception had been documented. By the time Thomas finished his presentation, the courtroom felt charged with the weight of evidence that could not be disputed or explained away. Mr. Morrison, Judge Chen said, do you have any evidence to contradict what we've just seen? Morrison shuffled through his papers, clearly stalling for time. Your Honor, we would need time to investigate these allegations and present our own evidence regarding the circumstances of my client's relationship. The circumstances seem quite clear, Judge Chen replied dryly. Your client was living with his wife while maintaining a romantic relationship with another woman who believed he was separated. Unless you're prepared to argue that cohabitation with one's spouse while dating someone else doesn't constitute adultery, I don't see what additional investigation would reveal. The exchange was devastating for Richard's case, but Thomas wasn't finished. Your Honor, there's another matter that needs to be addressed. We've discovered that Mr. Weber has been systematically transferring marital funds to support his business operations without proper documentation. Under Oregon law, these transfers constitute loans to his business that must be repaid to the marital estate. Judge Chen looked up sharply. How much money are we discussing? Approximately $400,000 over the past 3 years, Your Honor. The number hung in the air like an accusation. I glanced at Richard and saw him close his eyes briefly, finally understanding the full scope of his financial exposure. Morrison was clearly scrambling now. Your Honor, my client's business expenses were legitimate use of marital funds for the benefit of both spouses. Not without documentation and mutual consent, Judge Chen replied. Mr. Bradford, do you have evidence of these transfers? Thomas presented bank statements, business records, and an accountant's analysis showing the systematic movement of money from our joint accounts to Richard's business. Every transfer was documented, dated, and unexplained by any business loan agreement. Furthermore, Your Honor, Thomas continued, we can demonstrate that many of these transfers coincided with periods when Mr. Weber was using business accounts to fund his extramarital relationship. In effect, he was stealing from the marriage to finance his affair. The accumulation of evidence was overwhelming. Richard hadn't just cheated on his wife, he'd systematically looted their marital assets to fund the deception. Every romantic dinner with Brittany, every weekend getaway, every piece of jewelry he'd bought her had been paid for with money that belonged to both of us. Judge Chen spent several minutes reviewing the financial documents before looking up at the attorneys. Mr. Morrison, I'm finding it difficult to understand how your client can claim any moral or legal high ground in this proceeding. He's admitted to an extramarital relationship, failed to disclose systematic removal of marital funds, and apparently used those funds to support his affair partner. Morrison's response was pure desperation. Your Honor, marriages end for complex reasons. While my client's judgment may have been flawed, he's entitled to his fair share of marital assets accumulated during nearly 2 decades of marriage. Mr. Bradford, Judge Chen said, what exactly is Mrs. Weber seeking in terms of asset division? Thomas consulted his notes. Your Honor, Mrs. Weber is seeking to enforce the prenuptial agreement as written. She retains all premarital assets, which include her investment portfolio valued at approximately $8 million. Mr. Weber retains his business, subject to repayment of the $400,000 in undocumented transfers from marital funds. Additionally, we're seeking compensatory damages under the infidelity clause. What amount of compensatory damages? $500,000 as specified in the prenuptial agreement. The total was staggering. Richard would not only lose access to my premarital wealth, but he'd owe nearly $1 million in repayment and damages. His real estate business, already heavily leveraged, would be crushed by that kind of financial obligation. Morrison was visibly sweating now. Your Honor, these penalties would financially destroy my client. Surely the court can exercise discretion in enforcement. Judge Chen's expression suggested she had little sympathy for Richard's financial predicament. Mr. Morrison, your client negotiated these terms 18 years ago. He had independent legal counsel and months to consider the implications. If he didn't want to face these consequences, he shouldn't have committed adultery. The hearing continued for another hour, with Morrison making increasingly desperate arguments about the unfairness of the prenuptial agreement's terms. But every argument only highlighted how thoroughly Richard had underestimated both the document he'd signed and the woman he'd married. When Judge Chen finally rendered her decision, it was swift and comprehensive. The prenuptial agreement was valid and enforceable. Richard's adultery was proven beyond dispute. The undocumented business transfers constituted loans that must be repaid with interest, and the compensatory damages under the infidelity clause were appropriate and proportionate. Mr. Weber, Judge Chen addressed Richard directly, you negotiated a contract that protected both parties' interests while imposing severe penalties for betrayal. You cannot now claim ignorance of terms you agreed to simply because you chose to violate them. Richard sat frozen in his chair as the full implications of the ruling sank in. Everything he'd assumed about our divorce, everything he'd believed about his financial position, everything he'd planned for his future with Brittany had just been demolished by his own signature on an 18-year-old document. Morrison requested an immediate appeal, but Judge Chen denied the motion. This case is straightforward, Mr. Morrison. Your client signed a contract, violated its terms, and is now subject to its penalties. There are no grounds for appeal that would warrant staying this order. As court adjourned, I watched Richard struggle to process what had just happened. The confident man who'd packed his bags for romantic weekends while lying to his wife had been replaced by someone who looked genuinely lost. Morrison was already whispering urgently in his ear, probably explaining the astronomical cost of any further legal challenges. Thomas guided me out of the courtroom with professional satisfaction evident in his posture. "That went better than I'd hoped," he said as we reached the hallway. Judge Chen clearly saw through Morrison's theatrics. "What happens now?" I asked. Now Richard has to decide whether he wants to accept the court's ruling or bankrupt himself fighting it. Morrison knows this case is unwinnable, but he'll probably string Richard along for a few more billable hours before recommending settlement. The elevator ride down to the courthouse lobby felt surreal. Just 3 hours earlier, I'd been a woman fighting for her rights in a divorce proceeding. Now I was essentially a judgment creditor whose former husband owed her nearly $1 million he didn't have. My phone buzzed with a text message from Nancy. "How did it go?" "Better than expected," I replied. "We'll call you later." But before I could leave the courthouse, I spotted a familiar figure sitting on a bench near the main entrance. Brittany Hayes looked up as I approached, her expression a mixture of anxiety and determination. "Caroline," she said, standing up. "I was hoping I might see you here." "Brittany? What are you doing here?" "I wanted to make sure you knew that I've broken things off with Richard completely. I also wanted to apologize again, and to ask you something." I gestured for her to continue. "The affidavit I signed for your lawyer. Will that help make sure Richard faces consequences for what he did?" "It already has," I said. "The judge ruled in my favor on every point." Relief flooded Brittany's face. "Good. I know I can't undo the damage I helped cause, but I want him to face the full consequences of his lies." Her words surprised me. I'd expected her to be angry at being used in the divorce proceedings, not relieved that they'd been successful. "Brittany, you don't owe me anything. You were deceived as much as I was." "No," she said firmly. I chose to believe him without asking the hard questions I should have asked. I chose to trust someone who was clearly lying about major aspects of his life. That was my choice, and I have to live with the consequences. Her maturity impressed me. At 26, Brittany was showing more accountability and self-awareness than my 48-year-old husband had demonstrated throughout our entire marriage. "What will you do now?" I asked. "Focus on my business, I guess. Learn to trust my instincts better, and maybe be more careful about older men who seem too good to be true." We parted ways outside the courthouse, two women whose lives had been temporarily entangled by one man's selfishness and deception. But while Richard's lies had damaged both of us, they hadn't destroyed either of us. If anything, they'd revealed strengths we might not have discovered otherwise. The drive home gave me time to process what had just happened. The legal victory was complete and devastating, but the emotional victory felt even more significant. For months, I'd been living in a world of deception and manipulation, constantly questioning my perceptions and doubting my worth. Today, had Tao restored my confidence in my own judgment and my ability to protect myself. Richard's car was in our driveway when I arrived home. I found him sitting at our kitchen table, still wearing his court clothes, staring at a copy of Judge Chen's order. He looked up when I entered, and his expression was unlike anything I'd seen from him before. Gone was the anger, the manipulation, the confident superiority. In its place was something that looked almost like defeat. "Congratulations," he said quietly. "You won." "This wasn't about winning, Richard." "Wasn't it?" He gestured at the court papers. "You just destroyed my entire life. My business, my reputation, my future. all because I made a mistake. You made a series of calculated choices, I corrected. You chose to have an affair. You chose to steal from our marriage. To fund it. You chose to lie to both me and Brittany about what you were doing. Those weren't mistakes, Richard. They were decisions. Richard was quiet for a long moment, apparently struggling with the reality of his situation. When he spoke again, his voice was different. I underestimated you, he admitted. I thought you were just my supportive wife, who'd go along with whatever I decided. I never realized you were keeping track of everything, planning ahead, protecting yourself. I wasn't planning ahead, Richard. I was just paying attention. The planning only started when I realized what you were really doing. Morrison says I should appeal, fight the prenup, claim you manipulated me into signing it. Morrison gets paid whether you win or lose, I pointed out. How much more of your money are you willing to give him to fight a case he knows he can't win? Richard laughed bitterly. Money I don't have, apparently. According to this ruling, I owe you more than my business is worth. Then maybe you should consider settling instead of fighting. What kind of settlement are you offering? The question surprised me. I'd expected Richard to exhaust every legal option before admitting defeat, not to start negotiating within hours of losing in court. I'm not offering anything, Richard. Judge Chen's ruling stands. You owe what you owe. Richard stared at me, as if seeing a stranger. This isn't the woman I married. No, I agreed. The woman you married would have forgiven your affair, accepted your lies, and let you walk away with half of everything I'd worked for. But that woman died the day I heard you planning my abandonment on the phone with your girlfriend. The truth hung between us like a blade. Richard had gambled everything on his assumption that I would remain the accommodating, forgiving wife who'd always prioritized his needs over my own. He'd lost that gamble so completely that he was still struggling to understand what had happened. What happens now? He asked. Now you figure out how to pay what you owe, I said, and I figure out what to do with the rest of my life. Richard gathered the court papers and stood up slowly, looking older than his 48 years. I'll be staying at a hotel until I can find an apartment. I'll come back this weekend to get my things. That's fine. Just let me know when you're coming. After he left, I walked through our house, seeing it clearly for perhaps the first time in years. Every room held memories of our marriage, but they no longer felt like chains binding me to a failed relationship. They were simply part of my history, experiences that had shaped me but no longer defined me. My phone rang as I was making dinner for one. Nancy's name appeared on the screen, and I realized I'd never called her back after the hearing. Well? She demanded as soon as I answered. How did it go? We won, I said simply. Everything. The prenup is valid. Richard owes me nearly $1 million, and his business is probably going to collapse under the weight of his debts. Holy shit, Caroline. You actually did it. You beat him at his own game. I didn't beat him, Nancy. He beat himself. I just refused to go down with him. Same result, though. So what's next? Are you going to sell the house, travel the world, write a book about how to destroy your cheating husband? The question made me laugh. I don't know. Yet. For the first time in 18 years, I get to decide what my life looks like without considering what Richard wants or needs. That's terrifying and exciting in equal measure. Yes, I agreed. It really is. That night, I sat in my home office reviewing the financial documents that had secured my victory. The investment portfolio I'd built from my startup sale had grown beyond anything I'd imagined when I'd first deposited that check 18 years ago. I had enough money to live comfortably for the rest of my life, to travel, to start new businesses, to pursue dreams I'd set aside when I'd chosen to become Richard's wife. But more than the financial security, I had something else I'd almost forgotten I possessed. Complete control over my own choices. No more compromising my values to keep the peace. No more accepting behavior I knew was wrong because confrontation felt too difficult. No more living my life as a supporting character in someone else's story. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as Richard's financial situation became clear to his business partner, his creditors, and the social circle we'd shared. But tonight, I was content to sit in the silence of my own home and plan a future that belonged entirely to me. The woman who had overheard that phone call and felt her world crashing down was gone. In her place was someone harder, wiser, and infinitely more dangerous to anyone who might underestimate her again. 6 months after the courthouse victory that redefined my life, I stood in the newly renovated offices of Weber Consulting Group, looking out at downtown Portland through floor-to-ceiling windows that reflected both the city skyline and my own transformation. The business had evolved from a modest consultancy into something far more ambitious, specializing in helping women navigate major life transitions with strategic planning and financial literacy education. The idea had crystallized during a conversation with Brittany Hayes 3 months earlier. She'd called to ask for advice about a business decision, and during our talk, she'd mentioned how many young women she knew who felt unprepared for the financial realities of adult relationships. "We learn about dating and careers," she'd said, "but nobody teaches us how to protect ourselves financially or what questions to ask before we get serious with someone." That conversation had sparked the creation of my new division, Transition, consulting for women facing divorce, career changes, or major life decisions. The irony wasn't lost on me that my personal catastrophe had become the foundation for helping others avoid similar pitfalls. Nancy Rodriguez had been instrumental in developing the program, contributing her business expertise and serving as a sounding board for ideas. "You've always been good at seeing the big picture," she'd told me during one of our planning sessions. "Now you're using that skill to help people who are too close to their problems to see solutions." The first workshop had drawn 12 women, mostly referrals from Thomas Bradford's law practice. Word spread quickly through professional networks, and within months we were running monthly sessions that consistently sold out. The participants ranged from young professionals seeking prenuptial advice to women in their 50s planning for retirement after decades of financial dependence. One of the most rewarding aspects was watching women discover their own strength and capability. Like Maria Santos, a 38-year-old teacher who'd thought she couldn't afford to leave her emotionally abusive husband until she learned to analyze her financial options systematically. Or Jennifer Park, a recent college graduate who'd been pressured by her boyfriend to merge their finances before marriage, but walked away after attending one of our workshops on financial red flags. The business success had been unexpected, but welcome. More important was the personal satisfaction of turning my experience into something that could prevent other women from experiencing similar betrayals. Every workshop reminded me that knowledge truly was power, and that sharing that knowledge multiplied its impact exponentially. Richard's situation had deteriorated exactly as Thomas Bradford had predicted. Unable to pay the court-ordered damages, he'd been forced to liquidate his real estate business and declare personal bankruptcy. Michael Sterling had quickly distanced himself from the partnership, claiming ignorance of Richard's financial manipulations despite evidence suggesting otherwise. The social fallout had been swift and decisive. Our former friends had initially tried to remain neutral, but Richard's behavior became increasingly erratic as his financial situation worsened. He'd made the mistake of trying to blame me for his problems during a dinner party at the Sterlings, claiming I'd trapped him in an unfair prenuptial agreement and destroyed his life out of spite. Helen Sterling had shut down that narrative immediately. "Richard, you cheated on your wife and stole from your marriage to pay for it. Caroline didn't destroy your life, you did." The public humiliation had effectively ended Richard's place in our social circle. I'd heard through mutual acquaintances that he'd moved to a small apartment in Beaverton and was working as a sales agent for another real estate firm, trying to rebuild his career from scratch. The man who'd once prided himself on being a successful businessman was now essentially starting over at nearly 50, with damaged credit and a reputation for dishonesty. Part of me felt something approaching sympathy for his situation, but it was tempered by the memory of how callously he'd planned to abandon me. Richard had made his choices with full knowledge of the potential consequences. The fact that he'd underestimated those consequences didn't make him a victim. Brittany had thrived in the aftermath of the relationship's exposure. She'd used the experience as motivation to build her marketing business into a significant operation, specializing in helping small businesses develop authentic brand narratives. Going through something that false taught me the value of genuine communication, she'd explained during one of our occasional coffee meetings. She'd also become an advocate for financial education among young women, often speaking at our workshops about the warning signs she'd missed in her relationship with Richard. Her honesty about her mistakes and the lessons she'd learned made her a powerful voice for the importance of maintaining independence within relationships. I was so focused on the security Richard seemed to offer that I stopped paying attention to my own instincts, she'd tell workshop attendees. I gave up pieces of myself to become the person I thought he wanted, and I almost lost myself completely in the process. The transformation in both of our lives had led to an unexpected friendship built on mutual respect and shared experience. We'd both been deceived by the same man, but instead of letting that deception define us, we'd used it as motivation to help others avoid similar situations. Thomas Bradford had become more than just my divorce attorney. He'd become a trusted advisor as my business grew and evolved. "You've created something remarkable here," he'd told me during our most recent consultation. "You're not just helping women protect themselves financially, you're changing how they think about their own worth and agency." The legal precedent set by our case had also had broader implications. Thomas had been contacted by several attorneys, handling similar divorces involving detailed prenuptial agreements and financial manipulation. The thoroughness of our documentation and the clarity of Judge Chen's ruling had created a template for handling complex infidelity cases. "Your case proved that prenuptial agreements can be enforced even when one party has significant financial resources," Thomas had explained. "That's empowering for people who might otherwise feel powerless in divorce proceedings." The house in Forest Hills had been too large and too full of memories to remain my permanent home, but I'd decided against selling it immediately. Instead, I'd converted part of it into office space for my consulting practice and used the rest as a short-term rental for women in transition. It had become an unexpected source of both income and community. Several of my workshop participants had stayed there during their own divorces or career changes, and the informal support network that developed had been invaluable for everyone involved. Women who might otherwise have felt isolated during difficult transitions found themselves part of a community that understood their challenges and celebrated their progress. Linda Parker, my sister, had visited from Seattle last month and been amazed by the transformation in both my living situation and my perspective. "You seem more like yourself than you have in years," she'd observed. "Marriage to Richard was suffocating you in ways I don't think either of us fully realized." Her comment had prompted me to reflect on how much of my identity I'd surrendered during 18 years of marriage. The accommodating wife who'd prioritized Richard's needs and ambitions had been replaced by someone who knew her own worth and refused to compromise her values for anyone else's comfort. The financial security provided by my investment portfolio and the court settlement had given me the freedom to pursue work that felt meaningful rather than simply profitable. Every month brought new opportunities to expand the consulting practice or develop additional programs, but I was selective about which directions to pursue. The most recent addition had been a partnership with a local women's shelter to provide financial literacy workshops for residents preparing to rebuild their lives independently. These sessions were particularly rewarding because they served women who were often starting completely over with limited resources but unlimited determination. "Financial knowledge is freedom," I'd tell each new group. "When you understand your options and know how to protect yourself, you can make choices based on what's best for your future, rather than what feels safest in the moment." One evening last week, I'd received a call from someone I hadn't expected to hear from. Richard's voice was subdued when I answered, lacking the arrogance and manipulation that had characterized our final conversations. "Caroline, I wanted to call and apologize," he'd said without preamble. "Not because I'm trying to get anything from you, but because I need to acknowledge what I did and how wrong I was." The apology had been surprisingly genuine, lacking the self-serving justifications that had marked most of our interactions during the divorce proceedings. He'd taken full responsibility for his choices, admitted to the systematic deception he'd practiced, and acknowledged the financial theft that had compounded his betrayal. I convinced myself that I deserved more than what our marriage was giving me, he'd continued. "I told myself you wouldn't be hurt because you seemed so independent and capable. But that was just selfishness disguised as rationalization." I'd listened without interrupting, curious about what had prompted this moment of honesty. When he finished, I'd thanked him for calling but made it clear that the apology, while appreciated, didn't change anything about our situation. "I hope you find whatever you're looking for, Richard," I'd said, "but you'll have to find it without me." The conversation had provided a sense of closure I hadn't realized I needed. Not forgiveness, exactly, but acknowledgement from Richard that he understood the magnitude of what he'd done and the pain he'd caused. It was enough to finally put the emotional aspects of our divorce completely to rest. My personal life had remained intentionally quiet during this period of rebuilding and growth. Several people had suggested that I should start dating again, but I'd been focused on rediscovering who I was as an individual rather than as part of a couple. The freedom to make decisions based solely on my own preferences and values had been intoxicating after 18 years of constant compromise. Nancy had been my most persistent advocate for returning to the dating world. "You're attractive, successful, and financially independent," she'd argue. "You're exactly the kind of woman men your age are looking for." "Maybe," I'd reply, "but I'm not looking for them, at least not yet." The truth was that my experience with Richard had fundamentally changed how I thought about relationships and partnership. I'd learned that financial independence was just the beginning of real security. Emotional independence, the ability to maintain your own identity and values regardless of external pressure, was equally important. Any future relationship would need to enhance my life rather than complete it. I was no longer interested in being someone's supportive wife or allowing anyone else's needs to take priority over my own well-being. If and when I chose to share my life with someone again, it would be from a position of strength and choice rather than need or fear. The anniversary of Richard's departure had passed without fanfare or reflection. The date that had once seemed so significant was now just another day in a life that looked nothing like what either of us had planned. I'd built something better from the ruins of our marriage than anything we'd created together. Standing in my office that afternoon, reviewing the schedule for the upcoming month, I felt a deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with revenge or vindication. The workshops were booked solid, the consulting practice was thriving, and I was helping women avoid the mistakes I'd made while building something meaningful from my own experience. My phone buzzed with a text from Jennifer Park, one of my first workshop participants, letting me know she'd successfully negotiated a promotion at work and felt confident enough to buy her first home independently. These updates from women who'd found their own strength and direction were the real measure of the program's success. The woman who'd overheard that devastating phone conversation 18 months earlier would never have imagined this outcome. She'd thought her life was ending when her marriage collapsed, but instead it had been beginning. The betrayal that had seemed like the worst thing that could happen had actually been the catalyst for discovering capabilities and strengths she'd never known she possessed. The consulting practice would continue to grow and evolve, but its core mission would remain constant, helping women understand their own power and use it wisely. Every woman who left our workshops with greater confidence and clearer understanding of her options represented a small victory against the kind of manipulation, and financial abuse that had characterized my marriage. Richard had underestimated me completely, assuming I would remain the accommodating, dependent wife who'd always prioritized his needs over her own. His miscalculation had cost him everything he'd thought he valued, but it had given me something far more precious: the knowledge that I was capable of protecting myself and building a life entirely on my own terms. The afternoon light was beginning to fade as I gathered my materials and prepared to leave the office. Tomorrow would bring new clients, new workshops, and new opportunities to turn hard-won wisdom into practical help for women facing their own crossroads. As I walked to my car, I thought about all the women who would attend next week's workshop on financial red flags in relationships. Some would be young professionals like Brittany had been, looking for guidance before making major commitments. Others would be like I had been, successful in their careers but vulnerable in their personal lives due to unexamined assumptions about trust and partnership. All of them would leave with tools and knowledge that could protect them from the kind of systematic deception I'd experienced. They'd understand the importance of maintaining financial independence, asking difficult questions, and trusting their instincts when something felt wrong. The drive home took me through the Forest Hills neighborhood where Richard and I had lived as a married couple. The house that had once represented our shared dreams now served as headquarters for a business dedicated to helping women build independent, secure lives. The transformation felt appropriate, even poetic. That evening, I sat in my home office reviewing applications for the advanced workshop series we'd be launching in the fall. The demand had exceeded all expectations, with women traveling from across the Pacific Northwest to attend our programs. Each application told a story of courage, determination, and the desire to take control of personal circumstances that had previously felt overwhelming. The business had grown beyond anything I'd initially envisioned, but its impact was even more significant than its success. We were changing conversations about money, relationships, and women's financial security one workshop at a time. The ripple effects extended far beyond our immediate participants as they shared knowledge with friends, daughters, and colleagues. My phone rang as I was finishing the application reviews. Nancy's name appeared on the screen, and I answered with a smile. "How was your day, Mogul?" she asked, using the nickname she'd adopted when my business began expanding rapidly. "Productive," I replied. "We're going to need a larger venue for the fall series. The community center won't be big enough." "That's a good problem to have. Speaking of good problems, did you see the article in the Business Journal about women-owned consulting firms? They mentioned your company specifically." I hadn't seen the article, but the recognition was gratifying. More important than media attention was the steady stream of thank you notes and success stories from workshop participants who'd used their new knowledge to negotiate better employment terms, protect themselves in relationships, or start their own businesses. "I'm proud of what you've built," Nancy continued. "But more than that, I'm proud of who you've become. The person you are now is who you always were underneath. Richard just spent 18 years trying to convince you otherwise." Her observation resonated deeply. The strength, intelligence, and strategic thinking that had protected me during the divorce hadn't emerged from nowhere. They'd been there all along, buried under years of accommodation and compromise. Richard's betrayal had forced me to rediscover capabilities I'd forgotten I possessed. After we hung up, I walked through the house that had become both my home and the symbol of my independence. Every room told the story of my transformation from abandoned wife to successful entrepreneur, from victim of deception to advocate for other women's financial security. The journey from that terrible phone conversation to this moment of peace and purpose had been neither straight nor simple, but every challenge had contributed to building something stronger and more meaningful than what had been destroyed. Richard had intended to discard me in favor of a younger woman who would better serve his ego and ambitions. Instead, he'd freed me to become someone he'd never imagined I could be. The future stretched ahead with possibilities that would have been unthinkable during my marriage. new programs to develop, new women to help, new opportunities to expand the impact of hard-won wisdom. I'd learned that the end of one story could be the beginning of something far better, and that underestimating someone's strength and resilience was always a dangerous mistake. As I prepared for bed in the house that was truly mine, I felt gratitude for the unexpected path that had led me here. The woman Richard had thought he could easily discard had built something remarkable from the wreckage of their marriage. And every day brought new opportunities to help other women discover their own strength and write their own endings. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.